Good evening, everybody. We are here in the Bill Davis studio in Midtown Toronto to welcome you and our audience for this edition of TVO Today Live. Our subject tonight, protest. It's a constitutionally protected practice that has presumably helped many citizens over the years gain additional rights. Over the past decade or so, and especially since the pandemic, the size and intensity of protests in this country seem to be increasing. Is that because people don't feel heard through traditional political channels? Does it signal a shift in our democracy? This series is made possible by the generous support of the Wilson Foundation so that we can explore vital issues facing our shared democratic institutions. We are delighted to have 5 guests with us to think all this through. And we're equally pleased to have a live audience with us. And we're going to start by hearing from our guests and then later open it up to audience questions. So, without further ado, let's introduce Patrick Brethour, who's editorials editor at the Globe and Mail. Jacqueline Kennelly, professor of sociology at Carleton University and the author of Burnt by Democracy, Youth, Inequality, and the Erosion of Civic Life. Stephen Mensah comes to us as executive director of the Toronto Youth Cabinet, which is the official youth advocacy body for Ontario's capital city. Caryma Sa'd, lawyer, journalist, protest watcher, whose social media posts have put a spotlight on all manner of protest in the province. And Christine Van Geyn. She is Litigation Director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation and the host of Canadian Justice on the News Forum channel. And with that, I would ask our audience to welcome all our guests here this evening. That's great. Okay. Hello, you 5. Thank you for coming into TVO tonight. This is just great. The first question I have is actually not for any of you. I want to talk to them for a second. And I want to ask all of you, and you can give me a show of hands, I'll give you 2 options. The best way, the best and most effective way to express your voice as a citizen is by voting or by protesting in the streets. Hands up for voting. Okay, that's the vast majority of you by my eyes here. How about by protesting in the streets? Let's see a show of hands. A much smaller number. Okay, thank you for that. And I actually am kind of curious about how this group would react to that. Christine, you want to come in there first? What do you think, voting or protesting?
I think voting, but protesting is a form of expression that's available between elections. We only get to vote every 4 years. Protest is a way to express your position on topics or issues of the day that might not be the main election issue or that might otherwise have to wait. And it's also something that's available for people who are more marginalized, who don't have access to the halls of power, that might feel abandoned by the government of the day.
Caryma, what do you say?
I think it's a false binary, but
That's what we do in television.
Playing within those parameters. I echo a lot of what Christine just said, that voting has clear power and it's a way to express oneself at the ballot box and hopefully shape outcomes. But that lever isn't always effective if we don't have accountability from politicians. And so protest is a way to put fire under their feet, so to speak.
Stephen.
Yeah, I agree. I say voting. However, so oftentimes, especially with young people, we see that casting a vote for a politician is not necessarily going to guarantee that your interests and needs are actually going to be heard. And so that's where protest comes in and, raising awareness on the issues that we face as well as putting our issues at the forefront. I think for so oftentimes with young people who are that's necessarily disengaged from the voting process, they go about the protest route due to the fact that it's been more responsive and effective in getting their message and their voices heard. And we've seen many success with youth and student-led protests that has been more successful than voting has been historically for them.
Jackie.
Yeah, I'm going to sidestep the question completely because I asked a very similar question of the young people I interviewed, and I don't mean to bring it immediately to my book. Oh, this is what I read about.
But as long as you're holding it, you may as well show it up to the kid. There we go.
Beautiful book. And so I was interviewing young activists and young people who experienced homelessness in 5 liberal democratic countries, including Canada. And I asked them very similar questions. Which do you think is more important, voting or protest? And the thing is, it isn't so much the marginalized folks who have access to either. And this is the essence of the book is about how inequality, both wealth inequality as well as access to education, is affecting who is able to engage democratically, either in the formal systems or even in the informal systems. So I think there's a deeper issue at stake here about democracy and how it's being affected.
So the notion that those who are at the margins can have their say through protest, that ain't necessarily so either, eh?
Not necessarily so. It could be. It could be. But in the research I've done, it has generally not been, and I can talk more about why that is.
We shall explore that as we continue. Patrick, on the issue.
I too would duck around the banner. I would obviously democracy has to be a bit more than just voting on one day out of every 4 or 5 years. Civil society is part of it, and protest is part of it. And to me, part of a constructive protest is talking to your fellow citizens as well, not just the quarters of power. That's important, but swaying public opinion. And to me, that means that's necessarily a complement just to voting.
For those of you in the audience who said voting, let me point out a couple of inconvenient statistics here. In the last federal election, and I think if you go back for the last several federal elections, the turnout is about 2/3. And if you look at the last Ontario election, which is, where are we now? 2022, it took place, less than half the people voted. I think it was 48% turnout, which I also think was the worst ever. And the youth vote in both cases is also disproportionately low. People are, however, turning out for protests. And I wonder, who wants to pick this? Stephen, you want to pick this up? Is there a connection there between the fact that young people show up a lot more for protests than they do at the ballot box?
There is a connection because when young people do go out to vote, they're not heard at the end of the day. Unfortunately, we vote for politicians who we deem are going to have a pulse to our community, are going to have a pulse to the issues that we as young people are facing. However, so oftentimes when we do end up voting for politicians, our needs are not at the front of the council table or at the the legislature. And I think when it comes to protesting, beyond the whole solidarity and you're able to bring more young people to express unison with your cause, I think protesting, it really does allow for our issues to be heard at the council table. I'll use council since I'm at Toronto City Hall. And I think even more so when we talk about the fact that young people do not vote, we don't make it accessible for young people to vote. I think we need to, as a society, why are we not raising the excitement and the accessibility when it comes to going to vote?
Okay, hang on. What do you mean we don't make it accessible for young people to vote? You're in better shape than all the rest of us. You can vote as much. You have an easier time getting the polls than anybody.
But then we have the young people who are facing precariousness and have to choose. Yes, one might say, oh yeah, we have 3 hours to leave from your work to go vote. But young people who are at school or young people who might not just have the time to just take that time to go vote. And I think we have to also, when we look at ways to, I know some provinces, or not provinces, countries, make election days, no work days, right, and everyone can just go out to vote. I think we got to start looking at innovative and unique ways to not just get young people, but society at large to go out to vote. And I think that's gonna help in increasing the amount of young people who do go vote instead of are gonna hit the streets all in all.
Jackie, maybe this is a good point to further some of those points you wanted to make a moment ago, whether there's a connection between low voter turnout, but high protest turnout.
Yeah. So I think a piece of information when we're talking about young people that we need to keep in mind that is not necessarily widely known is that young people are poorer today than they've ever been. And the generations that were born, the millennials and thereafter, are less likely to be able to acquire wealth. They're less likely to be able to buy a home. I think all of us know that. They're likely to carry much more debt. And so that point I was making about inequality interfering with people's capacity to engage in democracy also applies to young people. It's not, I think, and evidence supports that it's not so much about youth attitudes as the shift in access that's been happening. And I'll say also, when I've spoken to young activists, they're the ones who are also voting. That doesn't mean universally, and they might be voting in protest or they might be spoiling their ballot, but they have the information to vote. Again, when I talk to the young people who are most marginalized, who've been most failed by the systems, and I'm talking about homeless young people, they don't even have the information to be able to go and vote. They don't have the education to go and vote. And that is a failure of our sort of collective education systems and us as a society, housing, et cetera, welfare, that these young people, they are not voting because they don't know how.
All right, let's do a deeper dive on protesting here. And I want to come to you, Caryma, because you have, in some respects, carved out a rather unique role for yourself in our province. When big protests happen, you show up and you take pictures. How did this start?
It started in the early days of the pandemic lockdown, and outside my office, there were weekly protests that were taking place on the streets, and I was curious what was happening because everyone else was shuttered indoors, and we weren't really hearing much about it on the news. And I went from watching outside my window to venturing out into the street, to talking to people, taking photographs of signs and speeches, and it kind of ballooned. And this was pre-convoy, and when it all manifested into the convoy, it became clear that this was significant. It was culturally, politically significant. And then post-convoy, there was a shift where some of the same individuals were now picking up different causes. And I started to be able to see patterns of people, of tactics, and that has now, in present day, it's manifesting in the Palestine-Israel protests.
What were the patterns you were picking up?
Well, there's a lot, but the most interesting thing to me is this class of what I term perennial protesters. And these are people who show up in different cities for different causes, but it's the same individuals. And somehow they're always leading the parade or at the forefront of things. And it made me question, what aspects of the protests that we're seeing, how much of this is grassroots, what's happening behind the scenes, what's actually driving all of this engagement. And so I think from that and interactions between perennial protesters and police, and regular protesters and police, and the role of law enforcement in keeping or not keeping the peace, I think that this all, it's part of a societal shift, and it touches on our civil liberties, because where there are chaotic episodes taking place and people become more and more averse to the idea of protest because of what they're seeing play out, I question, who does that benefit?
Let me go to Christine on this. Should it matter to us whether a protest is staffed by so-called professional protesters or whether the protests are sort of genuine, organic citizens rising up to make a point?
So who is us? Like the citizens to politicians? I think it should matter. It kind of indicates whether there is widespread support for a particular belief or proposition or value. I know I've watched a lot of your videos, Caryma. Some protests, I think, should be taken more seriously than others. And I think there have been some protests that I've seen you film are kind of a group of random issues all unrelated to one another. I think I saw a video you had of a protest that had anti-World Economic Forum, gender theory, anti-Trudeau, anti-vaccine, all jumbled together. And these were all the same characters who are at basically every protest. I mean, how seriously do we take that as a movement? In comparison, when you have thousands of people saying the same thing with a consistent message, I do think our politicians should pay attention to that. I think they do pay attention to those types of protests a lot less than the type that I was just describing. And I think we as citizens start to pay more attention to them as well when there's a clear message of what people are saying. When we don't know what a protest is actually about, it's not going to be very effective.
Patrick, let me get you to weigh in on that. Does the Globe and Mail, either through your editorials or through your reporting, make a distinction between the professional protesters who come to everything and want to get on TV, or thousands of citizens who, for whatever reason, emerge organically to champion an issue?
I think when we're looking at protests to an extent are an artificial event, and there's a real thing that are happening, but I think very few of them would be organic in the true sense. I think the point Christine made is key. If there's something at a certain scale, if there are organizers who are doing it consistently, that sort of stops mattering. If there's something of sufficient scale, it's something we'll pay attention to.
Is that okay? I want your feedback on that.
Sure.
Is that a distinction worth making?
Okay, so I'm going to sidestep again. Sorry, Steve, because I want to talk a little bit about, it's still relevant to the media and the portrayal of protests, because I've been covering, in terms of research, young people engaged in activism for a long time. Before that, I was a young activist, full disclosure. And I think there's also been a shift in the ways in which mainstream media has covered activism since 2011. So before 2011, there was a lot of kind of, in mainstream media, including Globe and Mail, a kind of demonization of young activists. And then in 2011, the Arab Spring emerged, and the Time magazine declared the protester, the person of the year was the protester. And then there was this kind of media shift that happened around more of a like and celebrating of young people involved in activism. Now, I'm not sure where we're at in terms of the media relationship to protests, but I think it's not just a neutral reflection of what's actually going on out there, but there's also kind of waves and swings depending on global events and the shifting of people who are in the media as well and what they're covering.
I would add, over time it's becoming less and less important to what the mainstream media pays attention to at all, of course. I think that the sort of parallel developments with social media means it doesn't really matter at this point if you're on the nightly news or if you're in the newspaper.
Because if you can take over social media and go viral, that's where it's at. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is that what's happened with you, Caryma? Have you kind of taken over the narrative of protests through your social media channels?
I do both. So it goes viral, and then I find that the content gets picked up by news outlets nationally, internationally, and so it makes its way into the news cycle. But to your point, the narratives that form around raw footage can vary greatly depending on who is watching and what lens they have and the spin they want to take. And that means that individual clips can stand for something different than what was actually taking place.
I want to get back to this false binary choice that we all had to deal with off the top of the program tonight. And okay, Christine, take this on if you would. Obviously, I think everybody in this room agrees that protest is legitimate free speech. We know politicians are kind of media trained to be on message track. So a lot of people have become disillusioned with what politicians say and kind of stop paying attention because they've heard it all before. They know it's not genuine. They know it's not authentic. But we've all been to a lot of protests that go something like, hey, hey, ho, ho, Premier Ford has got to go, which is not exactly the most thoughtful message out there either. Okay? So I guess we wonder now at this point, are either of these options at all useful anymore?
I think that there is obviously use in protest. I think slogans reduce a message to a soundbite or a core idea that these groups who are protesting want to express. It's not a place for nuance. It's not a place for complex, long conversations and debate. I mean, you can have conversations while at a protest, but the idea is to send a unified single message about a particular thing. And let's take the Freedom Convoy from 2022 as an example. There was a lot of chaos, a lot of different messages, but I think the core message was end mandates, end lockdowns. And I think that message definitely got across. I think that there was widespread media coverage of that particular protest because of the number of people involved. And likewise, current protests about the war against Hamas by Israel, by supporters of Palestinian people, I think that the message that they're sharing is a very clear one. I think that people pay attention to it because it is, even if it is a slogan, it's a consistent one and it's a clear one. I think the key is to have a discernible message and a number of people, and then you really will have politicians notice whether or not they take action. Sort of depends. The outcome of the Freedom Convoy, I think there was some success. On the lead up to the Freedom Convoy, the premier in Quebec had announced that they were going to impose a tax on unvaccinated people. That was rolled back. And you can't credit entirely with the protest, but you can certainly draw conclusions that perhaps it influenced it. Likewise, there were mandates in Alberta that were rolled back at the same time, and as well as in Ontario, all those were pre-scheduled to end. So I do think that protests have the ability to get attention, and that slogans, while that's not my preferred form of expression, I think if they are consistent and clear, they can have an effect.
On the other hand, there were a couple of things I do remember from those convoy protests. Patrick, let me start with you on that. One of the things I remember was a 2-word slogan. The first word started with an F, and the second word was Trudeau. So we do remember that. The second thing we remember, at least I guess some people would remember, was this notion that the protesters put forward saying they wanted the Governor General to essentially fire the Prime Minister and take over government.
Yes, the manifesto.
Right. Now, that kind of betrays a level of understanding of what's possible in a Canadian parliamentary democracy that presumably you would give an F to students for if you were marking their papers. Does it not?
Yeah, so I think the details were wrong. The sentiment was clear, which is we want to change in government, which I would say at the root is the fundamental point of a lot of protests. Either the government should change what it's doing, or we should change the government. So fair point. Certainly, probably a textbook on Canadian constitutionalism would have been helpful.
That's where you came in.
I mean, what I would say is I don't represent the convoy at all. We were involved in some litigation related to the use of the Emergencies Act, but my understanding from having attended the public order emergency hearing and participating in that litigation was that this Canadian Unity Memorandum of Understanding about the Prime Minister and the Governor General was not widely even known among convoy supporters. It was like one faction that was promoting this as some type of idea, and other members of the convoy, when they did learn about it, did distance themselves from it. Certainly, and the person who put that proposition forward was interviewed in the commission, and he admitted that he just didn't know. He's like, I don't know. Seemed like a good idea to me, but I don't know how this stuff works.
Well, let me get Stephen on that. When you heard about this at the time of the convoy a couple of years ago, that they wanted the Governor General essentially to take over government and fire the Prime Minister, what'd you think of that?
I thought folks are very angry, to say the least. And I think another thought that came to mind was going back to the messaging of protest, the core messaging that is first put out. I think when individuals start to see that government is not listening to those core values, core messaging of what they're originally and truly trying to put out, then that's when the creativity and the catchy slogans and all these other things start to come about. And those things do catch social media attention. I know when you see it on, SixBuzz and across the social media platforms, some young people and some just people at large start to pay attention to that, because obviously when you see that, you're like, obviously that doesn't make sense, it's not going to happen. But then you start to learn more and do a deeper dive. And so I'd argue maybe some of that messaging is working, because it does cause people to, I guess, tune in and pay attention and, I guess, kind of look a bit more deeper.
Okay, well, Jackie, let me go back almost 30 years for this next question, which is, and we're going to take you back to the time when Mike Harris was the Premier of Ontario and had ushered in the Common Sense Revolution in 1995. And he said a couple of things. He said, number one, by the time we're done, there will not be a single blade of grass on the south lawn of Queen's Park that has not been trod on by some protester. So he well understood that what he was about to embark upon was going to cause trouble. The second thing that he said was, do you really think we should be making public policy on the basis of how big the demonstrations are on the front lawn at Queen's Park. What's the answer to that?
Oh, goodness. So I think something that I think we're not touching on here in this discussion is about the purpose of protests. And I think it is to raise awareness about certain issues, but it's also about creating a collective and creating and generating and strengthening relationships, raising awareness. And some protests are more strategic than others and more sort of thoughtful and intentional. You know, in terms of building public policy on the basis of how many people turn out to protest, that's never going to happen. At least certainly not in the system that we currently have. I think having a connection between protests and the number of people who show up and the issues that politicians are willing to take seriously is one way in which to engage with democracy, but it cannot be the only way. And there have to be lots of different means through which people can engage with democracy, besides just voting and protest. There is and should be a whole range of ways in which folks' issues can be addressed.
Stephen.
I think for me, it really complements each other. You can't do one without doing the other, and protests do help in respects to, like we said, raise awareness on issues, show the level of solidarity and the amount of individuals who are in support, but also protests coupled with other tools of democratic engagement, like yes, voting, but giving deputations. When we talk about some of the actors we have in our systems and institutions will also play a role. I think one thing that comes to mind is the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism strategy. That came about due to the BLM protest. And it wasn't just due to the protest, but also some of the actors and figures we had inside the system who are also vigorously pushing. And so I think never to count out protests, because they do help to shape public policy, but not only by itself. It's with all the other tools of democratic engagement.
Well, Caryma, let me compare two different progressive conservative premiers from Ontario and get you to weigh in on which you prefer. Mike Harris said, I don't care how many people are out there protesting. It's in the common sense revolution. We're going to do it. We want a mandate to do it. We're going to do it. Doug Ford hears from a bunch of people who are unhappy that a couple of shifts on the UP Express got canceled, and he changes his mind in 30 hours later. And of course, there were big protests about the Greenbelt. He changed his mind on that too, and we could make a bit of a list here. Which kind of premier do you prefer?
Well, it seems that one of the premiers cares more about being liked than the other. And that doesn't make for a good leader, in my opinion. But having said that, I think you have to have some measure of responsiveness to the populace, because if you are just plowing ahead full steam regardless of what everyone thinks, that's not super democratic.
For a second there, I thought the headline that was going to emerge was Caryma Sa'd endorses Mike Harris's approach to governing.
Only one of them had me arrested.
Which one had you arrested?
Doug Ford.
Doug Ford had you arrested. There we go. Okay, we're about midway through here, so I just want to remind everyone that we are here in the Bill Davis studio in Midtown Toronto. There's another progressive conservative premier's name that's come up tonight. We're on a program called TVO Today Live, and we're talking about protest and its significance in our democracy. Our guest, once again, Patrick Brethour, Globe and Mail editorials editor; Jackie Kennelly, professor, sociology, Carleton University; Stephen Mensah, executive director of the Toronto Youth Cabinet; Caryma Sa'd, lawyer, journalist, protest watcher; and Christine Van Geyn, litigation director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Let's see, where do we want to pick up here? How about this? Once upon a time, I think it was fair to say that protest was sort of more the purview of the left. Unions, social justice causes, climate change. The left seemed to have, I want to say a monopoly, but certainly a bigger chunk of the protest movement. That is no longer the case. The convoy, the anti-vax movement, Patrick, start us off. Is that a significant change in who's out there protesting?
I think it is, and I don't think you can divorce the state of federal politics from that either. But clearly the vaccine mandates, which I have to say initially the Prime Minister had made a good point, saying imposing mandates would be divisive and that he didn't want to do it. And then came an election, and he did want to do it. So in, I guess, the Newtonian rule of politics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and there we were.
Christine, what do you say on that?
I mean, I'd have to see actual statistics to see how it has changed. I certainly have a vibe that it used to be a left-wing thing. It's become increasingly more attractive for right of center people to protest. I would add to your list protests over gender-related subjects like trans rights and kids and parental rights and things like that. I think that is a emerging issue. To some extent, the World Economic Forum, although I don't know really I don't think that's a clear protest topic. So I would need some numbers, but certainly I do get a sense. And I think part of that, I think that the demographics of the right of center have been changing. I think with international rising populism, there has been more of an attraction to right of center politicians by more working class voters than in the past. So this could be a part of that story, but these are all questions about things that I would actually need statistics to be able to tell you about.
Understood, but and I take your point about the fact that a lot of the right-wing protests in Ottawa were against a Liberal government, but we had a lot of right-wing protests at Queen's Park against vaccinations, pro-convoy, against the Conservative government at Queen's Park.
And it's a global phenomenon as well.
Yeah.
There's a global factor to that as well. Anti-immigration protests in Europe, for example.
Okay, Caryma, protests seem to be met more often these days, at least in Canada. This feels like a fairly new phenomenon, by counter-protests. So the protesters show up, and then the other guys who want to protest against the protesters show up. Is that new? It feels new.
I don't know that it's new. It is what's happening. And there's an element of theater to that, with people showing up, and it's not about discourse or dialogue, and it doesn't have to be, but it also is about getting media clips and sound bites and who's going to look better and how do we, in some cases, shut the other guys down. And I think that there's something to explore there in the way that civility, there's a breakdown in civility, and there is an unwillingness almost to be able to disagree with one another without making that deeply personal. And I think that is a little bit harmful to our social fabric overall, because it bleeds from protests in the streets to the ways that people interact with one another elsewhere, online, in real life, and it leads to labeling without due process, attempts to harm people's livelihoods, their family lives, and it's very destructive. So I think that is a phenomenon that exists and is one that should be looked closely at.
Patrick, I bet the Globe and Mail just loves it when one group of protesters show up and then another group of protesters show up to protest against the protesters, and the police are caught in the middle, and there's the potential of a melee. That's a great story.
Or a disaster for any hope of democratic discourse. So you use the word civility, and we wrote on this a couple of weeks ago, and I think there's this misguided idea that being civil, listening, is somehow negates your free speech. And the point we made is it's necessary for free speech. What good is freedom of speech if no one listens to you? So,
can I quote a bit from your piece? Because it captured a lot of attention. It was an open letter signed by a lot of prominent people calling for greater civility, expressing concern about a broader, worrisome trend of Canadians being unwilling, unable, or ill-equipped, you said, to engage with people with different or strong views. I'm curious as to what you thought that could accomplish, putting it as prominently in the paper as you did.
Yeah, so to be clear, that was a very powerfully worded open letter from a number of concerned citizens. We also wrote an editorial alongside that, and that was the entire editorial page that day, so we felt it was very important. Because we see protest becoming not just a voicing of opinion, but an exertion of power on the streets. Verging into, in some instances, something that is really just mob rule. Running the Prime Minister out of a restaurant in Vancouver, running the federal cabinet out of the AGO so they can't meet with the Italian Prime Minister. That's not a protest to give voice to something. That's to control the streets.
Okay, so let's get into some discussion about that. Jackie, should there be, when people want to protest, no-go zones, as in you don't go to the premier's house and protest on his front lawn, that kind of thing. What do you think?
So I think I'm going to avoid the question again. Sorry, Steve.
Oh my gosh, Jackie.
Because I don't know what the answer is, and here I am, sociologist, right? This is academics. So I'm going to step sideways and say I don't think any of what we're discussing is actually new. I think there have been protests and counter-protests for as long as there have been events. There have been people who gather together, and it feels like mob rule to a particular segment of the population, but not to others. In the labor movement at the turn of the 20th century. And so, like, should there be no-go zones? I don't feel qualified to answer that, but I do think there has to be a balance between allowing for freedom of expression and the right to protest and protecting people's safety and well-being.
For sure. But, okay, let me get a little more specific. Christine, if you're pro-Israel in this Middle East dispute, should you be able to go to a mosque and scream down a service? Or conversely, if you're pro-Palestinian, should you be able to go to a synagogue and scream down a service?
It's actually a criminal offense to interrupt a religious service. But I do think, as distasteful as it is, it's permissible to protest. It's legal to protest on the sidewalk, on public property outside of a religious building. This has happened. It happened at a synagogue in Toronto. And you know, as a society, I do think that we should condemn that type of behavior. It's anti-Semitic to protest in front of a synagogue. It's Islamophobic to protest in front of a mosque. These are things that we should say are bad, but they are not criminal offenses. I think that if we were to criminalize that type of behavior, you would make martyrs out of the people who engage in that type of behavior. You would give them a platform to defend their conduct, and I don't think that that is what we want. Now, there are all kinds of limits on protests. You can't protest on private property with some contextual exceptions. You cannot blockade property. You cannot blockade public roads. You can commit criminal offenses when you're engaging in a protest. You could be charged with mischief, with intimidation, with assault. You could be arrested for disturbing a breach of the peace, which is not a criminal offense, but you could be arrested and detained for it. So there's all kinds of limits that we place on protests. Protests are not illegal, but illegal things can happen at protests. And when they do, the rule of law requires that we stop them because we are a rule of law nation here in Canada.
Okay, let me pick up on that. Caryma, what do you have to, in some respects, have some sympathy for the police nowadays who find themselves at these demonstrations at which some illegal things are happening, and they're just trying to keep the peace. They're trying hard. You gave me one of these things, so with me, you're not sure that you agree with me here.
Sure,
but they're, from what I've seen, they're trying really hard not to bust people and take them off to jail. They're trying to get people to chill. Fair or no?
It's somewhat fair. I think that police are most concerned about preventing this breach of peace once they themselves are affected by unruly behavior. So we've seen the Toronto Police Association, for example, put out an open letter because some of their members and even the mounted unit, the horses, have come under assault. But what's the lead up to that? And my observation has been that police aren't particularly proactive. They don't deal with the isolated incidents of breach of the peace as they happen along the way. I've been at protests where I've been under assault in front of police and there's no intervention that takes place.
Tell us about that. Who was assaulting you?
I can't even, there's so many incidents. There's so that's a problem,
Were
right?
they protesters who were assaulting you?
With protesters, with counter-protesters, it happens in full view of police
And they let it go.
and nothing happens. And
What
I think,
should they do?
I think that there needs to be attempts to enforce the law, right? There is a toolbox that exists within the criminal code, and that makes me wary as well of legislation being introduced, protest bubble zones, or the Emergencies Act, right, that are very intense and I think unnecessary if the actual law is enforced. So I think that there's a role for police to play to be more on top of things because, and we saw this with the convoy, and I think we're seeing it with the Palestine-Israel protests, if bad behavior is ignored, then it emboldens people to keep upping the ante.
I hear you, but Patrick, what do you do when there's 10 cops on the scene and there's 600 protesters?
I mean, I do have some sympathy for the police in that they don't want to throw a match into a tinderbox, and that, you know, there were incidents. There was a fairly noteworthy incident at the main shopping mall in Toronto of someone screaming threats. A person was arrested then, but they were later charged. So, I mean, certainly what you're talking about is different. That's a danger to your person. That should not be something that they let go. So I do have some sympathy for police. I think perhaps sometimes they take that a little too far, as we just heard, in letting illegal acts go on. Another thing I wanted to point out, though, Christine made some excellent points on the boundaries of the law. But beyond that, there's a lot of things that, the letter made that point, that are not a good idea, that are not illegal. Like, it's not illegal to swear at my grandmother, but very bad idea. Very bad idea. So there's a society that exists outside of, bounded by the law, but also outside of it, obligations that we owe each other. And I think that's something that I see that is framed dangerously.
Well, okay, apropos of your call for greater civility, let me try this. Stephen, we'll get you to start on this one. Civility, you could say, is really overrated when it comes to climate change. If we have the calls for civility in trying to combat arguably the most existential problem we have today isn't doing too well. Or Indigenous reconciliation. You could argue that practicing civility is not helping move the yardsticks forward. Racial justice, I mean, the list is endless. Is civility overrated?
No, because I think, we talk about community guidelines and we talk about code of conduct. I think what Warrior call it rules of engagement. I think ultimately we can't lose sight of respect in one another, the kindness, the positive discourse, because ultimately we all have to live with one another. We all have to, the cohesiveness of society needs to still be present. And so despite the tremendous amount of urgency that all these issues that you've listed require and deserve, I think we need to balance that with the reality that ultimately, if I'm going to go protest at a politician's home with their children present, or go protest at a school and just disrupt and make noise, is that going to lead? It goes back to the message, and the message of my protest, is that going to lead to success, a policy change, or is that just going to lead to, I guess, that politician or members of society just being just angry with you and just upset? Because ultimately, I think one thing I've noticed a lot is there are individuals who do support causes. However, then your protest or your actions end up harming that individual who does and actually does want to support you. So yeah, answer is no. I think we should continue to keep the respect and civility and the kindness, because ultimately that is going to get us out of many of the problems that we're facing.
I have a feeling I know how someone who is a director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation would respond to a question about whether civility is overrated, but I don't know. Maybe you'll surprise us.
I don't know. I don't know what you think I'm going to say. But civility is a value that I have, but it's not a value that everybody else has. And I don't expect everyone to share the same values or desire to communicate the same way that I do. And in fact, the point of a protest is to be disruptive. It is to sometimes make people angry, in particular the people in power. So I think an overemphasis, civility is how we all would speak to one another, and I do value it, of course, but I don't think that is a constitutional value. And the whole idea of a protest is that we are going to mess things up. And sometimes it will make people who have their life interrupted by a protest upset. That's the point.
We are going to go into the audience in just a couple of minutes to take questions. I see Tina here is putting out a microphone in the middle of the floor. So if people want to start to line up to ask questions, I'm going to put one more up here, and then it'll be your turn, okay? So let's finish up on this here amongst ourselves. Whatever else it is, protest is accessible to all, and it's being used by a lot of people to have their say. Can we get some ideas here about how we get more of what we like when it comes to protesting and less of what we don't like? You've been to your share, Caryma. You want to start us off on that?
Yeah, I think that an important value is being neighborly to one another. And if we can be good neighbors, and if that is something that is thought of at a protest, even if its intention is to disrupt or make people uncomfortable, prompt reflection, being neighborly is something we should strive for in order to reduce the polarization that we are currently dealing with.
Patrick, what do you say?
I would say, certainly I would echo that thought, and I think the idea of being civil holds within it the idea that maybe you're wrong, so you should listen. A totally separate thought. I do think police need to reconsider how they're approaching protests, and in the first instance, create a bit of error between protesters and things like Prime Minister, to think a little harder and not wait weeks to make it clear to protesters that they should not be trying to overshadow a Jewish Canadian neighborhood. That's about it. That shouldn't take weeks. That should be made clear at the start. But then outside of those fairly narrow restrictions, then allow protest to flourish. But I think there's a role for police to play, a limited role, and they should be a little more activist.
Jackie.
I think the lack of civility or the kinds of conflicts we're seeing in protests are also not necessarily originating there, but originating in the polarization that's happening largely in social media, and that we also need to look wider than the space of protest to understand why that is, and the sort of concentration of particular messaging and the way it creates tunnels, and the responsibility of some of these large companies like Meta to what? We don't want them controlling speech, but there's certainly a phenomenon that has to do with social media and its proliferation that I think we haven't really touched on here. That's also relevant.
Okay, as you can all see, there's a very long line of people there. So I think let's get to them. If you like, give us your first name, maybe where you're from, and then fire away.
Sure. Hi. Good evening, everyone. I'm Emily. I'm from Burlington. Thank you all for coming tonight. This has been a wonderful discussion. So my question, and this was briefly touched on, is I think we all can agree that we live in an era of cancel culture. So when a view that's not shared by the majority is expressed, it can lead to loss of employment, repercussions in personal life. So my question is, how effective is protest in the age of cancel culture?
Anybody in particular you want that for, or
No.
have at it?
Have at
Christine,
it.
you want to start?
I think we should probably be specific about what we are defining cancel culture as. I will take the definition of you said something online that was, on a touchy subject, and you said it in a way that people have now called for you to be fired. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Sure, online or
Or in person. Sure,
person,
you've said something and now people want you fired.
Right.
I do think that they're just fundamentally different phenomenons. So I think cancel culture is very much targeted at individuals, whereas protest movements are designed to achieve some type of social change. I don't like cancel culture. I don't think it's good to target individuals because they expressed some particular view. I mean, yeah, in some circumstances, perhaps, but especially when we're talking about calling back to something someone posted online as a 15-year-old. Yeah. I think that that's a negative phenomenon. I think we should resist mob instincts to pile onto a person like that. But I actually don't think that the motivation of cancel culture is achieving social change. I think it's a collective desire for revenge driving that, rather than, I want to end a particular war, or I want to end a particular government policy, or something along those lines. So I do think they're quite different.
Emily, guess where Christine grew up?
Burlington.
Sisters in Burlington. There we go. Okay, thanks for the
Thank you very
question,
much.
Emily. Yes, please. Next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nora. I'm from North York. Thank you all for your very insightful comments. I had one question, and it kind of draws back to the beginning of the program. We're talking about youth engagement, voting, and protesting. So obviously there's a segment of the youth population that aren't able to vote, so those ages 13 to 17. Mm-hmm. What element do you think that they play in the rise of the protest movement? And should there be more to give them an outlet of civic engagement that goes beyond voting and protesting?
Am I allowed to ask how old you are?
I am 20.
You're 20?
Yeah.
Going in post-secondary somewhere?
Yeah, I'm in my 3rd year at U of T right now.
Taking what?
I'm studying peace, conflict, and justice and anthropology.
Oh, wow. This is the right show for
very
you
apt.
then. Well done. Okay,
Not
Nora.
at Trinity, though.
Nora, well done. Okay, Stephen, that's got your name on it.
I think there should be more beyond voting. I think when we talk about giving deputations, I remember last city deputation, we saw individuals who were 13, 14 years old who are out giving deputations, speaking to issues that were really dear to their heart. I think we should have Toronto youth cabinets across this world, truthfully, to give young people the opportunity to advocate on behalf of themselves and the issues that they face. You know, when we look at protesting, I think for the young people who are not able to vote, that is an easy route for them to also leverage. Last couple months ago, we did deputations. And one thing I heard from young people who were not able to vote was, Stephen, they're not going to listen to us, the politicians. Like, that's going to go out one ear and through the other. But then, yes, so many young people were still able to go give deputations on behalf of the TYC. And we got a number of numerous wins in the budget. And so I think all in all, despite the, disenfranchisement, just the fact that many politicians are not hearing our youth, young people continuously taking other routes of civic engagement or democratic engagement beyond, voting, but giving deputations, sending letters, calling their politicians is working more than we think. But having avenues where they can express themselves, like through bodies like TYC and other bodies where they can actually be heard, is going to be effective in the long run.
You know, I was on the subway earlier today and saw a bunch of young people all talking way too loud, throwing F-bombs at each other, and it makes me so disillusioned about the future. And then I meet someone like Nora, and I am inspired again for the future. So there, let's just put that out there. Yes, please, you're next.
I'm Ron, I'm from Toronto. You discussed quite a bit about the role of civility. I wonder about the role of violence, whether it's underrated. We've had the French Revolution, the American Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder how far the suffragettes would have got without, the hunger strikes. I wonder how far Martin Luther King would have got without Malcolm X being in the background. Mm-hmm. So I wonder comments on the element of violent protest and revolution.
Ron has asked an uncomfortable but very interesting
Sorry about that.
question.
I'm a 60s kid.
It's okay. No, we got the right group for this. Who wants on that one? The role of violence. Okay, you want to start? Then we'll get some more. Yeah.
Violence is a criminal offense, and it does not have a role at protests. And if you engage in violence at a protest, you can and should be arrested. Now, Martin Luther King was one of the biggest and most famous advocates for nonviolent resistance, and the protests that he led. When we talk about protest as the future of democracy, it's also the past of democracy. It's how people in the United States of color gained equal rights. So I do not think that violence has a place in democracy or in protest, and I don't think it's a legitimate form of expression.
Anybody want to disagree with that up here?
I'm not sure I disagree, but I would speak from the experience of being involved in social movements and interviewing young activists that the debate about the usefulness of violence is still part of the lexicon, but I also think we need to define what violence means, that it's usually not a debate about whether protesters or activists will harm others, but whether something like property damage or other sorts of disruptive but not violent to other humans is acceptable. And there's been a dialogue for decades now about diversity of tactics and whether to stand in solidarity with people who are committing acts that others don't agree with. I don't think there's any place to land there. Not that there isn't a place, but I don't think anyone has landed in a specific place there. But I also think the examples you gave are quite diverse. So if we're talking about the French Revolution or the American Revolution, we are talking about armed rebellions and guns. And then if we're talking about the suffragettes going on hunger strikes, they were doing that to themselves and responding to violence from the state, like it was the state and police violence against their bodies. So I think we need to be more nuanced about what we mean by violence and the role it can play in a
Actually, Ron, don't go away. Ron, stay at the mic for a second. As a kid who grew up in the 60s, Have you taken part in your share of violent demonstrations? Yeah. And would you
And the bomb.
And would you say
First.
it was a constructive
Anti-Vietnam,
experience?
of course. Well, if you didn't lie down in the street and get arrested, I mean, nobody paid much attention.
Yeah. But that's nonviolent
that's not
protest.
violent.
I'd call that nonviolent
Well,
protest. Yeah.
The state arrests you as violence.
That's the
By the
violence.
state.
Sure. So it's not the protesters instigating
No, it's
the
the
violence.
state. But
yeah.
if you call the state out and they are violent, you
Yeah.
win support. That was a strategy that was much used.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But you're
Thanks.
not assaulting officers or Caryma.
Oh, no.
Anyone who assaults Caryma should be charged.
I second that.
Ron, thank you for that question. Very good. Yes, please. Next.
Hello, I'm Vera, also from North York, and I have some thoughts and questions about the most recent protests that we're witnessing from the perspective also of multiculturalism and Canadian foreign policy. So I was wondering, so in a country such as Canada, where we value multiculturalism as a principle, and we view it as a strength, shouldn't our foreign policy consider this aspect of multiculturalism in forming this policy? And what we're seeing in the most recent protests, could it be perhaps
Which ones are you referring to?
the Gaza and
Okay.
Palestine-Israel protests? So I'm thinking, if we value the principle of multiculturalism, but our foreign policy perhaps does not, is not as shaped by this principle, is this not fueling some of these protests? And I'm just interested to hear from the panel.
Tuffy, who wants in on that?
I think that part of what we see with Palestinian protesters out in the streets is a way of exerting their collective power as a political unit, where previously maybe they feel to have been unheard or are unheard just based on Canada's track record. It's interesting the online reaction sometimes to scenes from these protests with people denigrating multiculturalism as though that's the core issue here. And I don't think it's quite that simple. And I also believe that as groups kind of come into this sense of power, that it needs to be wielded responsibly. And that is what we should be striving for.
Gotcha. Vera, what's your first language? I'm curious.
Bulgarian.
Bulgarian. Wow. Okay. Do you want to say something in Bulgarian, like "nice to be here this evening" or something like that?
That's okay, I'll pass.
Okay. Thank you for coming this evening. Yes, sir. You're next.
Hi there. Nice to see y'all. My name's Akib. I'm from Scarborough. Shout out to Caryma. Her journalism really allowed me to have a voice as an ally as best as I can try to be. So we're worried about how proactive police can be, what kind of policing is the best kind of way. I've seen how they are at protests. I'm glad that they're there. I don't think it's optimal. They could be so much better. And I'm worried about the costs that have been getting used up, as much as there is a level of protection that's there. What kind of like innovative approach do you think could be possible? Because to stand there and have a conversation and echo what their voices are. Yes, I hear that the specific date of October 7th was terrifying and was unfortunate. There has to be consequences. Yes, there is a chronic extremism applied onto a particular land that requires more indigenous validations. What kind of ways can we get more intermediaries into these more high intensive kind of situations? Block watchers, community safety teams, but that's more security, where they have to kind of distance themselves from protests. But is there these job roles? Is there these intermediary assignments that are more possible? Because I don't think police have the policies in place just yet to kind of get there.
Thanks for that, Akib. Who wants in on that?
I have a thought, just again, from other protests. that have taken place in Canada in recent history and in past history, that there are lots of possibilities for more creative and educational ways of engaging the issues, right? Rather than the kind of conflict. Now, the issues we're talking about, especially Israel-Palestine, are so heated. It makes it really difficult. But things like puppet shows, or or dancing puppets on the streets, or kind of playful signage and things like that we've seen protests and activists engage in different kinds of events. There are different kinds of interactive theater that has been created by groups in order to get people talking about issues in more nuanced ways. So
what does that do, Jackie, when you have that kind of street theater happening?
Well, I think, in its ideal form, it's a chance to talk about things in a more nuanced way, right? That allows some of the complexity to come out and the different perspectives to be heard in a way that is less polarized. And I think in general, our kind of media landscape, as well as the education that's available to people, it needs to keep engaging at these issues in a more complex way, so that the polarization that is really quite easy to fall into otherwise is combated.
I'll add a few comments on policing tactics. So policing tactics changed after the G20 protests in Toronto. The pendulum kind of swung from this strict enforcement model to where a lot of excessive policing happened at G20. Now, obviously, those protests got completely out of control. I was working downtown at the time, and my office was shut down, and there was a police cruiser burned by protesters in front of it. A lot of windows were smashed. There was a lot of Antifa and black masks committing all kinds of crazy acts. But there was also kettling of completely unrelated people for hours. And I think that there was I think it was $16.5 million settlement for people who were swept up in those protests. A settlement with the Toronto police. And after that incident, the pendulum kind of swung to this de-escalation type of approach that police have been using more now, sort of to the chagrin of Caryma as she witnesses a lot of...
De-escalation's a good thing, but...
I do think de-escalation is overall better than excessive force. But we had a negative outcome in Ottawa at the Freedom Convoy, where this over-focus on de-escalation and too much accommodation led to that protest, whose cause I sympathized with the extent of the lockdowns. I did think it was excessive. But the protest also went on for an extended amount of time. There were blockades that are unacceptable. It needed to be shut down, and the police really didn't do an effective job in managing that particular protest. So that kind of showed that the pendulum went too far in the other direction. So I hope that provides a little bit of insight into what's happening on the ground with protests as they interact with police. And I think another big part to emphasize is the importance of creating boundaries between protesters and counter-protesters, and that you can't arrest a counter-protester. Their speech is just as valid as a protester's. It's equally constitutionally protected. And you can't arrest someone for their own safety because another group of people might come and try and hurt them.
Caryma.
Just picking up on the resources that are put towards policing, and just the immense amount of manpower that I've seen, of technology that's deployed, and it's quite a rare phenomenon, I think, to be doing something poorly and the result is budget increases. But we see that with police in protests. And where police inaction can sort of create a landscape where now a more heavy-handed approach is justified, more resources toward police are justified, and that sometimes is fueled by protesters or counter-protesters who are setting out to antagonize and engage with police and maybe have an incident take place so that that can be capitalized on. Like, there's a propaganda element to this as well. And so the two sides of the coin feed each other, and there's an industry in this. And I think that we need to be very, very wary of that and of how our public resources are being used and how that may incur on our civil rights.
This gentleman.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm from Toronto. I've subjectively noted that in the convoy protest movement and protest movements previously, when they've been covered frequently, like the protest organizer, organizers, or organizations involved, they've sort of put forth statements or been interviewed as part of that. And I noticed these protests in the last half year that have been going on, that hasn't really been the case. Where you've heard people speaking, the organizers have been speaking, and I've noted some instances where protests have actually targeted on sort of foreign policy with regard to Gaza, have targeted like municipal politicians, provincial politicians, and I think I saw one with regard to a school board even. And I just, I would be interested in hearing the rationale why lower levels of government are being targeted for protests on foreign policy. But my question is who, in terms of the organizers or the adults in the room, is that not as much of a thing with regard to the recent protests? Is it more ad hoc than like the convoy or previous protests?
Jonathan, you know what? Patrick's got something here.
I would agree with sort of the back half of your statement. I would quibble with the idea that the Freedom Convoy had sort of a coherent leadership, and I think that was part of the problem we were talking about earlier with the manifesto, that the media at that point couldn't quite get their heads around the idea that there wasn't sort of person A and person B who had organized this, that it was organic a bit. So, I would agree that that's certainly the issue.
The names are sort of in my head, like Tamara Leach. And
absolutely, there were people there, but if you recall, she had tremendous difficulty leading.
As the folks behind Occupy Wall Street have the same problem. No overall leader, no overarching message. It was a bit tricky. Yeah, okay. Jonathan, thanks for that. Okay. Yes, please, you're next.
Hi. Hello, my name is Kamita. I was born and raised in Scarborough and currently at the University of Toronto Scarborough studying international development and political science. I want to take this question a bit more global. I know we've been seeing in a lot of countries across the world a unified effort towards dismantling the rights to free assembly or actually organizing and bringing people together. And my question to all of you is, to what degree is a protest a tool at protecting or also a tool at making democracy more vulnerable?
A tool in making democracy more vulnerable. Okay.
I do not think it makes democracy more vulnerable. I think that the right to express yourself freely and assemble is actually internationally the exception. It is incredibly rare and it's incredibly precious. And we need to preserve our right to go to our government and say,
disagree.
Forget you, Trudeau. Because in many places in the world, if you were to do that, not only would you be killed, your family could be killed. So I think fundamentally these are core to democracy and enhance the democratic experience.
Stephen.
For me, obviously protest is a tool in the toolbox, and it's we have a right, so on and so forth. But I believe, and it kind of goes back to my earlier comments, is if as a society individuals are solely utilizing protesting as a way to ensure that their voices are heard, then we don't have a healthy, strong democracy. I think that's where it makes it a bit vulnerable, and it should make all of us worry, is that if the first action an individual is going to take is let me go hit the streets instead of let me go vote or the pew or email my politician or see my politician on the street, I think that's a problem, and I think that's is that the way we're headed? I hope not, but I believe that starts raising alarms if individuals are quick to go protest instead of, utilize the other democratic ways of engagement.
Part of my job is to keep an eye on the clock, so I see two more people in line. Let's get those two in, and then we'll call it a night. And we just actually heard under his breath the best line of the night. When you said, "Forget you, Trudeau," Patrick said under his breath, "Oh, that's what the F stood for." Well done. Well done. Yes, please. You're next.
Hi, my name is Carla. I'm from Mexico, but I live in Toronto. And I wrote a letter to Marco Mendocino because he's in my district.
He's your MP?
Yes, my MP, thank you. And he never wrote me back. And I wrote a hand letter. And after,
what was in the letter?
It was for ceasefire. I asked for ceasefire. And because he voted no, he was one of the only ones that voted no. So he never wrote me back, but then there were the protests at the 401 and Avenue, and I went to protest, but there was like 40 police, and like it was just no way. So in Toronto is the only place that you cannot protest. So my question is if we're losing our right to protest.
Well, this goes back to what we talked about earlier about where it's okay to protest and where, in their wisdom, political leaders have decided it's not okay. I guess I should get some feedback here. What did we think about the fact that the 401 and Avenue Road, where there is, I guess, part of Toronto's Jewish population lives in that area, and it was determined that the protests would not be acceptable there anymore. Jackie, you want in on that?
I think I want to echo what Christine said earlier about how important it is for us to protect the rights that we as Canadians enjoy and are able to have, and that they are under threat. They're always under threat. That democracy is always a thing that we have to work towards. Now, I'm just going to sidestep again. I'm sorry, Steve, that question of whether the protest should have happened there. I think, protest against within Jewish communities, I think, is potentially riding in on anti-Semitism in a way that is much more complex. But I do think that the story you just shared about writing a letter to your MP and not getting any response, I think is a shared one, right? In that sense of futility and, why should I bother if it's not going to have any effect? I would also echo Stephen's point earlier about the need for people to have a whole wide range of ways in which to engage democratically, and that we could be working collectively on having a lot more of those opportunities that are actually, that are funded, that are supported, like the Toronto Youth Council, so that there are other ways in which to engage democratically and feel like you're actually being heard.
Just before I go to you, Christine, Carla's example is a great one in as much as I'm hearing from people all the time who say whenever they call their MPP or their MP, you get a voicemail. It's impossible to talk to a real person anymore. When you send emails, you get an automatic kickback and it, thank you for your email and, don't expect to hear from us, that kind of thing, because we're inundated. You can understand why people feel that they're not being listened to by people who have power. And therefore, it ends up in the streets. Anyway, Christine.
Yeah, I'll just put aside for a minute the fact that your MP didn't write back to you. This is a very normal experience. Did you know that protest was blockading a Jewish community when you decided to go?
No.
Because that is one of the things that people said is anti-Semitic, and I agree with them, and I condemn that particular blockade. I condemn the targeting of a Jewish community because it's Jewish, and I condemn the idea that area you could not come in and out of without, I think there was one other way in and out of that particular community. That's wrong. That's anti-Semitic. It's not the Jewish people who are responsible for the actions of the State of Israel, which, by the way, I support. I'm a Zionist, I'm a proud Zionist, and I believe in Israel's right to defend itself against the terrorist threat of Hamas. Now, we're free to say these things to each other because we live in a free society, and I also support your right to express your disagreement with you and express it in a civil way. There is no constitutional right to blockade a road. That's why that blockade was ended. That's why the protest was not allowed to continue. It's because it wasn't just a protest on the sidewalk, which is permitted. It was a protest that blocked the entire road. Like the Freedom Convoy, it should have been removed as it was blockading infrastructure. There's also a criminal offense of intimidation if the purpose of a highway blockade, which is part of the criminal code offense, is to intimidate a particular group, that can rise to the level of intimidation, and it can result in criminal charges. So I hope that you respect that I am expressing my particular views on this issue, as I respect that you want to engage in protests, and I support your right to do that.
I just want to clarify that the blockading of the road was actually police who blockaded the road. So initially, you had protesters who were staying on the sidewalk. And then I think the second or third week in, at least once it was on my radar, you had counter-protesters. And at that point, police shut down the entirety of it. They kept everyone on one side of the bridge or the other. Counter-protesters didn't really come back in large numbers, but police consistently decided to block off the bridge. And so their response there, I think it was almost a Streisand effect, where you're being told not to go, and now that makes us want to go more.
Did they obtain an injunction as well? I think there was an injunction.
There was an
as well.
application. The application failed because there was no evidence that was supporting the injunction. But ultimately, what happened there was the police chief made a political decision to say no more, certainly not on this bridge, and then other bridges were enforced selectively.
But is the point here that demonstration should have been at the Israeli consulate and not in a neighborhood?
Yes.
That is the point.
Yes, if you're protesting Israel, if you're at the bridge, you're protesting something else.
Gotcha. Okay. Sir, you're our last one tonight. Go ahead.
I'm the last one, of course. My name is Amari Taylor, and I'm the lead organizer and director of Toronto Freedom Rallies every Saturday at Queen's Park. We've been protesting since 2020, since the lockdowns and everything. And I just have a question for Caryma, right? With all the protests that you go to, why do you feel that, like, with all the protests that are happening, people go to the protest, want to wear masks, or they protest and they feel afraid to show their face and everything? I just wanted your opinion on that. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I think there are different reasons to mask up. One is to conceal one's identity. And that could be coming from a black bloc perspective, where protesters want to be indistinguishable from one another and sort of act as a mass. And other times it's as simple as, my job is somewhat sensitive, and if I'm seen here and someone else acts out, I may be in a precarious position. So I think that with all of the surveillance that exists at protests, people live streaming, police having their cameras, you're not in a private spot when you are publicly protesting. Some people will take precautions to, in their minds, protect themselves. And there's also, I would say, a much smaller subset of people who continue to mask for COVID reasons.
Mr. Taylor, when you do your protest, are you masked up?
Nope. Ever since the lockdowns and stuff, no, I didn't put a mask on. We were against the mask mandates and obviously the vaccine.
But you don't mind the police knowing who you are and all that as well?
I don't. I just they see me, right? I even wear a body cam and stuff, so I'm really good with the police and everything. And yeah, we do our protest. And what I've noticed over the past 4 years, that first you're angry, right? And that's what most people, when they get into protest, they're angry and everything, right? And then what I find that's really what's more effective is that, as I've learned, is that once you start relating to people and start engaging, you can't be angry, right? Mm-hmm. Because when you're angry and stuff, the people you want to reach, you shut them out, mm-hmm. right? But when you start having fun with doing the protests, like what I do, right? You start engaging with more people and stuff, and obviously we have signs and stuff, so I don't have to do the talking. We have our own signs, and people look at the signs, they read, and you start. They ask the question, and you start engaging with the public and everything. So
got it.
My advice for people who are doing protests or organizing protests from both sides, even Palestinians or the Israel or the Jewish community and everything, start I know it's dire situation and people are dying and stuff overseas, right, and everything, but try to relate to people, right, and not be so angry because you're trying to wake up the people that you're trying to.
Mr. Taylor, that's a perfect place to leave tonight's discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a call for civility. Well done.
Every Saturday, Queen's Park, 12 o'clock.
There he is. Thank you very much. Okay, well, that is our time, and we've got to do a few thank yous before we leave here. First and foremost, I want to thank this audience for coming in tonight. Sure. You got a million other things you could be doing, but you were here as engaged citizens partaking in this broadcast. So thank you for coming out tonight. I want to thank our crew here for staying late tonight and making the show look so good. So well done. We want to thank the Wilson Foundation. You know, Red Wilson is our benefactor. He's a great man. And he has been incredibly generous with his support of this series, which we really hope can add something valuable to thinking about the future of democracy here in Ontario and beyond. And finally, yeah, these five here. Patrick Brethour from the Globe and Mail, Jackie Kennelly from Carleton University, Stephen Mensah, Toronto Youth Cabinet, Caryma Sa'd, lawyer, journalist, protest watcher, and Christine Van Geyn, Canadian Constitution Foundation. We are really, this was such a great discussion tonight, and I thank you also for giving up your evening to be with us. For more on everything we've done on this series, visit tvo.org/TVO Today Live. That's tvo.org/TVO Today Live. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time. And for that program, we are going to be coming to you from fabulous Sault Ste. Marie. So until then, thanks and good night, everybody.